it's on, it's red. So, what time is it? Maybe we... Ok, sì, grazie, quello non ne abbiamo bisogno. Maybe we can start, if somebody else arrives. Good afternoon to everyone. A warm welcome, both to those here with us in the splendid Aula Magna at Dolfin, and those following us online, which I don't see, of course. So today's event is organized by NISH, the Center for Environmental Humanities at Foscari, University of Venice. For those who don't know me yet, my name is Cristina Baldacci. I am an associate professor in history of contemporary art at the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Heritage, and an affiliated faculty with NISH, where I am the principal investigator of the Ecological Art Practices Research Cluster and the Art Ecology series, of which this event is part. So it is my great privilege to introduce today's guest speakers, Jakob Lund, on my right, professor of aesthetics and culture at Aarhus University, Denmark, whom we will hear from shortly with a talk entitled Sensing and Imaging Planetarity, and Francesco Spampinato, on my left, professor of contemporary art history at the University of Bologna. Francesco will join me as a discussant following Jakob's presentation. And both Jakob and Francesco are friends and colleagues, as well as members of the Ecological Art Practices Research Cluster, with whom I have long enjoyed a fruitful dialogue and collaboration. In fact, next week, I'll do a bit of promotion here.
Why not?
The three of us will also be at the University of Bologna, along with many other colleagues, to take part in the third edition of the Summer School in Climate Change, organized by Francesco, which this year will focus on indigenous perspectives and artistic utopias. So if you happen to be in Bologna, who knows, yeah. Particularly on the second day of the summer school, so on Thursday 9, we look forward to seeing you. Allora, before handing over to Jakob, I would like to briefly highlight some of his key projects and research activities. There are so many, I had to, of course, sum up a little bit. So Jakob is the director of the Center for Research in Artistic Practice under Contemporary Conditions at the School of Communication and Culture of Aarhus University, founded in conjunction with the launch of a major research project of the same name. The center is an important hub for examining how contemporary art functions as meaning-making in our socio-political and environmental realities. The investigation of the contemporary condition has been at the heart of Jakob's thinking for several years. In 2016, he conceived and has since then co-edited alongside Jeff Cox the successful book series, The Contemporary Condition, published by Sternberg Press, which I strongly recommend to you if you are not yet familiar with it, as it brings together essays that are extremely helpful for understanding our complex contemporary world, written by a diverse group of interdisciplinary authors. Jakob himself is the author, together with Cox, of the first book of the series, entitled The Contemporary Condition, which was published in 2016, and which brilliantly serves as an introduction to the series. And also of another book of the series, Anachrony, Contemporaneity, and Historical Imagination, published in 2019, a theoretical exploration of how the notion of contemporaneity relates to the end of a certain history of art. Jakob has published widely within aesthetics, art studies, critical theory, and comparative literature on topics such as image politics, subjectivity, memory, mediality, enunciation, and, as already mentioned, contemporaneity. His most recent author book is The Changing Constitution of the Present, Essays on the Work of Art in Times of Contemporaneity, also published with Sternberg Press in 2022. Today, we are thrilled to hear him explore another key concept, that of planetarity, which brings to the fore non-human temporalities and othernesses that go behind human perception. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jakob Lund. Jakob, over to you. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks a lot for that introduction, and thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here in Venice, especially in this room, which is so unlike anything we have in Denmark, I think, at least in Aarhus. As Cristina said, I'm going to talk about, under the title, Sensing and Imagining Planetarity, and the lecture is you could say, an initial step in a new research project called Towards an Aesthetics of Planetarity, Mapping and Material Mediation as Ecological World-Making. And it's sort of trying to, or I am trying to set a new research agenda for myself, or sort of to develop from this notion of contemporaneity. So any suggestions or comments are more than welcome, since this is sort of still very much a work in progress. And I will launch this research project next year when my current research project has ended. So the historical present we inhabit is strange and unprecedented, not only in an obvious chronological historical sense, but also in a cognitive and existential sense. For the first time in human history, philosopher Emanuele Coccia writes, "We are experiencing not this or that ecosystem, not this or that place, but the planet as a whole." This is so not only because of technological developments, omnipresent sensors, etc., that allow us to see and feel the totality of Earth in real time. Rather, the quality of knowledge of the planet has changed, for even in the smallest and most local of events, we are forced to glimpse the totality of the planet. The climate crisis is the reunification of all geological, biological, and ecological manifestations, turning every event, even the most insignificant, into an act and behavior of the entire planet. Earth has never shown itself simultaneously to all of humanity in a similar and identical way, Coccia states. So as a result of the appearance of the planet as such, as a whole, we are experiencing an intensified not only global but planetary interconnection and entanglement of coexisting forms of times, making us, as inhabitants of the same Earth and across our cultural differences and national and regional histories, share the same historical now, you could say. And this is a sharing of time that is not equally shared or shared equally. At the same time, we find ourselves in a new climatic regime which in many ways escapes our usual human sense apparatus and habitual ways of perceiving our environment. The ecological crisis is therefore also, as remarked by writer and philosopher Baptiste Morisot, a crisis of sensibility, the disappearance, which has been underway for a long period of time, of our everyday relations with the living and other life forms. A univocal testimony to our growing disconnect to nature is how our language has changed. The use of nature-related words has dramatically declined by more than 60% between the year 1800 and 2020, according to a recent study that looks at 28 everyday elemental and descriptive nature words, including river, bud, dew, marsh, and blossom. Another example is the Oxford Junior Dictionary, widely used in classrooms in the UK or in the United Kingdom, which in its 2007 edition removed dozens of entries related to the natural world, including acorn, bluebell, and magpie, to make room among its 10,000 entries for modern inventions like blog, chat room, and MP3 player. And this is remarked by journalists specializing in climate change, Kate Yoder. So nature, in other words, is disappearing from our language and hence from our lives, and it is difficult to sense and care for something that you do not know. As indicated, the emergence of planetarity has fundamental consequences for how we experience time and history and for how we experience the present. My lecture consists of two parts. The first part is mainly theoretical, maybe a bit heavy, and titled Contemporaneity as the Interconnected Temporalities of Globality and Planetarity. And the second part, which is slightly longer and which will include a few examples, is titled Making Planetarity Sensible. So part one, contemporaneity as the interconnected temporalities of globality and planetarity. Reflecting on the temporal quality of the historical present, philosopher Peter Osborne makes a strong argument for understanding contemporaneity as the temporality of globality. Writing, if we understand the temporal logic of the new to be a cultural expression of the temporality of capital accumulation, its tendential global extension brings with it not just a global modernity, but through the latter a new temporal structure articulating the fractured temporal unity of this global extent. Contemporaneity is the temporality of global modernity, the temporal project of globalization. As climate change and ecosystemic crises increase, we need, however, to extend the notion of contemporaneity, understood as the conjunction and intensified interconnection of different temporalities and histories in the same historical present, to include the temporality of planetarity. The planet and the sense of planetarity emerge in the aftermath of the project of globalization. As a result of the modern Western project of human mastery and emancipation, of extractivist and destructive work on the earth for profit and imperial power. This also means, as philosopher of science Bruno Latour argues in his book Down to Earth, that politics not only concerns how humans can live together, but now should be defined as what leads toward the earth or the planet and not toward the global or the national. The distinction between globality and planetarity builds on, among others, literary theorist and philosopher Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, who sets the word planetarity apart from notions of the Earth, the world, the globe, and globalization in their common usage. The planet belongs to alterity. I quote Spivak. The globe is on our computers. No one lives there. The global notion allows us to think that we can aim to control globality. The planet is in the species of alterity, belonging to another system, and yet we inhabit it on loan. So the globe is an anthropocentric construction, supported, for instance, by the iconic blue marble photograph of Earth taken from Apollo 17 in 1972, seemingly allowing us humans to make a perfect representation of the planet that make our and many other species' life possible. Whereas a planetary perspective strives to decenter the human being, and I quote Spivak again, if we imagine ourselves as planetary subjects rather than global agents, planetary creatures rather than global entities, alterity remains underived from us. It is not our dialectical negation. It contains us as much as it flings us away. So globalization implies an understanding of the globe as a unified system of circuits, flows, and circulation of humans, capital, information, goods, images, cultural expressions, etc. In other words, globalization primarily concerns human activities. The globe is an abstract, systemic, and anthropocentric model of the world. It separates human and nature and idealizes the latter. Planetarity emerges as a disturbance of the global order, an alterity that cannot be derived from us, which we cannot control, but of which we form part and interfere with. To experience or sense the planet is an experience of something that is the condition of human existence and yet profoundly indifferent to that existence. I see contemporaneity as the temporality of planetarity, or rather as the interconnection of the temporalities of globality and planetarity. Without using the term contemporaneity, historian Dipesh Chakrabarty remarks that Earth System Science, ESS, places humans at the conjuncture of three interconnected histories operating at different timescales: the history of the planet, the history of life on the planet, and the history of the globe made by the logics of empires, capital, and technology. This means that the Anthropocenic regime of historicity as visible in Earth system sciences sets humans against a background of relationships and time that necessarily cannot be addressed from within the temporal horizon of human experiences and expectations, that is, from within the global regime of historicity. The planet emerges from outside the temporal horizon of the human subject and the modern anthropocentric regime, a global regime of historicity. If, as philosopher Paul Ricoeur's account of historical time in Time and Narrative, historical time is a narrative mediation of cosmophysical time and social phenomenological time, then the social phenomenological time has entered into a closer relationship with cosmophysical time, and the human being as sovereign agent and narrator of the mediating narrative is now challenged. In other words, the general decentering of the human subject in environmental humanities also has important temporal implications. And this invites us to revisit Immanuel Kant, the philosopher of Enlightenment and Western modernity par excellence, and how he, in the words of theoretical physicist Carlo Rovelli, sought the basis of the temporal structure of the world in something that closely relates to our way of thinking and perceiving, to our consciousness, that is, to the mind of the human subject. In his reflections on time and space, in his transcendental aesthetics in Critique of Pure Reason from 1781, Kant famously formulates axioms such as time has only one dimension, and different times are not simultaneous or coexistent, but successive. Here, time is an a priori given independent of our sensory perception. The imagination is linked to time in the form of inner sense, and the function of the imagination is to synthesize the progressive sequence of representations in time. In Kant's analysis of the sublime, understood as what he calls the seeming omnipotence of nature, 9 years later in the Critique of Judgment, however, the normal operation of the imagination is reversed and institutes what Kant calls a regression that annihilates the condition of time and makes intuition of coexistence possible. The sublime violates the model of linear temporal progression in the ordering of the manifold, the successive apprehension of percepts in a temporal sequence, and radically shifts to an instantaneous grasping of coexistence. Thus, the comprehension of the manifold in the unity not of thought but of intuition, and consequently the comprehension of the successively apprehended parts at one glance, in einen Augenblick, is a retrogression that removes the time condition in the progression of the imagination and renders coexistence intuitable und das Zugleichsein anschaulich macht. So the sublime involves a radical cancellation of ordinary temporal unfolding and disrupts our habitual ways of perceiving and experiencing the world. Rather than annihilating time as such, however, the regress of the imagination, the comprehension in an instant of what was successively apprehended, suggests a possible negation of the mathematical or linear form of time. Therefore, since the time series, or die Zeitfolge, is a condition of the internal sense and of an intuition, it is a subjective movement of the imagination by which it does violence to inner sense, a violence which must be proportionately more striking the greater the quantum which the imagination comprehends in one intuition. Here it is worth remarking that Bruno Latour makes an interesting connection between contemporaneity and the spatialization of time, or what he calls the time of cohabitation. He claims that his so-called Dingpolitik, or thing politics, based on matters of concern, that is, things that bring us together to negotiate what sense to make of them, may become possible when politics is liberated from its obsession with the time of succession. The time of succession, as formulated by the Kantian axioms, is the progressive and one-dimensional time of modernity. So Latour writes, philosophers define time as a series of successions, as does Kant, and space as a series of simultaneities. Undoubtedly, while we filed away everything under the power of progress, we lived in the time of succession. Strangely enough, we have changed time so completely that we have shifted from the time of time to the time of simultaneity. Nothing, it seems, accepts to simply reside in the past, and no one feels intimidated anymore by the adjectives irrational, backward, or archaic. Time, the bygone time of cataclysmic substitution, has suddenly become something that neither the left nor the right seems to have been fully prepared to encounter. A monstrous time, the time of cohabitation. And then he says, everything has become contemporary. To be consistent with the terminology that I'm trying to develop, I would substitute the time of contemporaneity for the time of simultaneity to stress the interconnection of different times and different scales of time, human, non-human, ecosystemic, and geological. So when you talk about simultaneity, you could say that is about things that happen in parallel, but the main idea about contemporaneity is the interconnection of different temporalities. From this, we may sense that time is not, as Walter Benjamin remarked, an empty, homogeneous duration unaffected by the events that fill it. Time is mediated, constructed, and multiple, not some blank a priori, and there are many different coexisting ways of being in time and belonging to it. The experience of contemporaneity is perhaps sublime in the sense that it is an interruption of unified linear time. The condition of contemporaneity, however, does not allow us any distance to that which would otherwise elicit an experience of the sublime. Today, there's no temporal outside to the sublime spectacle, so to speak. And Latour remarks that it becomes increasingly difficult for the Western subject living in the Anthropocene to enjoy any feeling of the sublime. In the Anthropocene, we humans have realized that we are part of the overwhelming nature we used to see as a separate and remote phenomenon. He writes, to feel the sublime, you needed to remain distant from what remained a spectacle, infinitely inferior in physical forces to what you were witnessing, infinitely superior in moral grandeur. Only then could you test the incommensurability between these two forms of infinity. Bad luck, there's no place where you can hide yourselves. You're now fully commensurable with the physical forces that you have unleashed. As to moral superiority, you have lost that too, he says. The difficulty, I argue, of experiencing the Kantian in what we now, the Kantian sublime in what we now have begun to call a planetary age, not only concerns the nullification of our distance to that which would trigger experience of the sublime, that is, the loss of a secure position from where to experience something as a sublime spectacle. There's also an important temporal aspect. Our human lives are critically entangled with the geobiochemical processes of the earth, and our earthly imaginations must strive to include temporalities that exceed our sense-perceptual capacities. Our bodies and our times are inescapably implicated in environmental changes. Living in the age of planetarity means to contemporaneously inhabit the interconnected presence of the history of the globe, or world history, and of Earth history, where what seems slow on the scale of the globe may be instantaneous on the scale of the Earth. The temporality of planetarity cannot be ordered and shaped by our internal sense. It is an emphatically more than human temporality that exceeds our inner time experience and the chronological ordering of the manifold in the human consciousness. As stated already, the temporality of planetarity arises from outside the temporal horizon of the human subject as something that conditions our existence, but which at the same time is indifferent to that existence. So my understanding of contemporaneity therefore entails a more spatialized conception of time and history, what Latour productively terms the time of cohabitation. In light of the emergence of planetarity, I'm interested in the spatialization and the plasticity of time and history, and in image formations that bear witness to time's own historical mutability, its politics and its aesthetics. That is, representations that testify to the fact that time is not as such something static, and that the events of which it is composed cannot be represented from a non-situated objective view from nowhere. This can be observed, for instance, in the artistic history textbooks of the American female education activist Emma Hart Villard in the first half of the 19th century. Villard's temporal mappings may be read as problematizations of the chronological and historical maps rooted in the Western Enlightenment, in which time is represented as pure length, as an arrow or a timeline used to give form to dynastic successions, growth and progress, and to naturalize homogenizing universal histories. Villard's presentation of temporal processes in more spatial forms, such as the tree and the river, enables alternative historical narratives and a sensibility for temporal coexistence. alternatives to linear, progressive, times-killing arrow mode of the techno-heroic, as Ursula Le Guin calls it in the carrier bag theory of fiction from 1986. So now I come to the second part, called making planetarity sensible. So the modern Western presupposition of the possibility of creating a temporal distance or divide between human world or globe and Earth or planet, of detaching a history-making human subject from an objectified, relatively static Earth as its material foundation, a resource at our unrestricted disposal, has to a large extent been supported by art, you could say. Writer and curator Filipe Ramos, for instance, states that art, in particular Western art, should acknowledge its contribution to the gradual constitution of the modern individual and its alienation from the natural world, visions that led to the current state of planetary crisis. At the same time, it is through art and aesthetic practice that the ecological crisis can be addressed as a crisis of sensibility, as pointed out by Baptiste Morisot and many others, that awareness of planetary sense-making may come into being. Aesthetics concerns sensuous cognition, initially defined by Baumgarten as cognitio sensitiva, of living bodies in specific temporal and spatial conditions. Sensuous cognition is characterized by a certain reflexivity with regard to the sense we make of phenomena given to our senses and perception. And as many of you probably will know, in Kant's work, the reflective judgment of taste is the capacity to find a concept that corresponds to a given phenomenon for which we do not have an immediate concept, in contrast to a determinative judgment where the phenomenon is immediately subsumed under an already given concept. This is a bottle. Therefore, fundamentally, aesthetics concerns situated sensing and reflective processes of sense-making, but these activities or practices are not necessarily confined to individual human subjects confronted with discrete, delimited objects, as I think is the case in Baumgartian and Kantian aesthetics, roughly stated. Often they operate collectively and in constellations or entanglements that comprise human as well as more than human actants. Aesthetics pertains to the ability to perceive and to be concerned, and what qualifies a practice as aesthetic is an exploration of the modes and the means by which reality is sensed and perceived. An aesthetic practice becomes artistic, I think, when this exploration is intensified and socialized, when it is presented publicly as part of or at odds with society's common sense. Artistic aesthetic practice is therefore not only a particular way of engaging with the sensuous world, but also involves the production of aesthetic reflective perception. In artistic practice, the production of aesthetic perception is addressed to a public. Understood this way, an artistic aesthetic practice proper involves the invitation of an audience, a public, to take part in the process of sensing and sense-making. It exhibits or holds out the world and initiates a negotiation of how that which passes as reality should be perceived and what sense to make of it. I work from the hypothesis that artistic mappings and non-representational material mediations offer a particularly fruitful field to explore ways of sensing planetarity. Traditionally, cartography is an instrument of power, domination, and control. Maps are used to navigate and to take our surroundings into possession, to master nature and colonized territories. Mapping or cartography has to do with the visual description of spatio-temporal relationships. By describing spatio-temporal relationships, it is, however, also an articulation of a worldview, not an objective and universally valid representation of the world, but a particular way of world-making. And by world-making, I mean sort of processes of imagining and creating reality, how we relate to our environment, how we shape our society and subjective realities through symbolic, aesthetic, and scientific activities. So we need to dismantle the modern cartographical view of planet Earth, which rests on the idea of the planet as a globe that can be depicted, represented by and to human subjects as a unified entity based on some data set. And one is reminded of Martin Heidegger's 1938 essay, The Age of the World Picture, in which he describes how the world becomes a picture or Bild because it is brought before or represented, vorstellen, by human subjects. And he sees the defining historical shift of modernity to be the endeavor to make the world stand at humankind's disposal, conquered, and that the human contends for the position in which, and he says, man can be the particular being who gives the measure, can be that particular being who gives the measure and draws up the guidelines for everything that is. So modernity has produced a break in the lives of modern people between the world they live in and the world they live from. The world they live from has now, in the age of planetarity, erupted in the midst of the world they live in. The modern world and the worldview it allows for was placed in the space of grid-based maps. Thus, the paradigm that guided mapping in the modern era was scientific geometric, privileging exactitude and measurability. It aimed for a universal view of the world. What Latour calls landing on Earth requires a different view of the material world, which appears to be much more complex than the rather ideal or abstract notion of matter and space imagined earlier. I argue that one way of landing on Earth and re-establishing our connection to our natural surroundings is through artistic mappings and remappings of our world, and through artistic explorations of changed and expressive forms of environments and environmental processes as mediums in themselves. In other words, I see such practices as taking part in an aesthetics of planetarity, a kind of planetary counter-visualization to what visual culture scholar Nick Mirsov calls the Anthropocene aesthetic capitalist complex of visuality, in which our sensorium and modern ways of seeing are still deeply embedded. So it's also an endeavor to formulate or be attentive to this kind of counter-visualization. Prominent among endeavors to create planetary sense-making is the project Terraformer of Book of Speculative Maps by science historian and theater director Frédéric Etouati, landscape architect Alexandra Arène, and architect and urban planner Axel Grégoire. The form of mapping they propose constitutes a break from the modern approach in which the human being is detached from its surroundings and where a subject-object relationship prevails. A break from the modern approach that seeks to establish a view from nowhere. An objective scientific description of the world based on static quantities, coordinate systems, administrative boundaries on the surface, and similar abstractions, and on a conception of space as emptied of life, available, occupiable, colonizable. In contrast, they place emphasis on overlapping spatial relations and multidimensional temporally situated entities, and they see the Earth as being populated by a conglomeration of living organisms and underground objects, commemorative traces, industrial elements, rocks, bacteria, tunnels, water, volcanoes, etc. They write that the map is no longer a fixed image, rather a provisional state of the world, a working tool in evolution, constantly generated by living things. It also changes the status of space. It is no longer a simple container, but rather a living, resonant milieu, composed of thousands of superimpositions and actions of the beings that surround us, constantly and indefinitely produced by the movements and perceptions of those who create it. In this way, the authors of Terraformer propose prospective tools for imagining the future of our milieu. As they write, their models are perspectives on reality, possible visions of the world, sketched through depths, movements, points of life, peripheries, pulsations, voids, disappearances, and ruins. They produce situated, embodied knowledge. So it's an invitation to imagine with the earth and with more than human species. Such thinking about imagining and sensing Earth also guides the interdisciplinary collaborative digital project called Feral Atlas, curated and edited by environmental anthropologists Anna L. Singh, Jennifer Deeger, and Alder Kieleman Saxena, and artist and architect Fei Su. The project explores ecological worlds or feral ecologies that come into being when non-human entities become enmeshed with human-built infrastructures, but which develop and grow beyond human control. Of the large maps drawn by Fei Su in Feral Atlas's exhibition for the 2019 Istanbul Biennial, Filipa Ramos remarks that they depict territories at a stage when the troubled relationships between bodies and history unfold. Drafting cartographies of environmental and social disarray, her maps and drawings reveal how humans are in no way separated from the ecologies they disturb. Instead of inculpating viewers, highlighting their responsibility in the messy situations they portray, they invite a different conception of what it is to live, making people aware of how they are part of an unruly family of outlandish, cosmic, dangerous, and interdependent creatures on board planet Earth, beings in beings. The editorial group sees the Anthropocene as a set of incompatibly scaled effects. Stressing an open-endedness of scale, they speak of a patchy Anthropocene in which interlinked patches can range from a spot of insect dung to a great forest, from microscopic to continental. This means that, here's another quote, this means that many processes are happening at the same time at different tempos. The only reason this is not obvious is that the ideology of progress has trained people to think that, that only one trajectory could be headed toward the future. Everything else was either irrelevant or a patch of a not yet dissolved backwardness. This narrowing of attention shaped understandings of both humans and non-humans. Primitive people were imagined as if they lived in a timeless past removed from the time of ethnographic fieldwork encounters, as anthropologist Johannes Fabians showed in his seminal study Time and the Other from 1983. Other living beings were also imagined as static machines of reproduction. Once they attained their evolutionary status as a species, perhaps millions of years ago, they never changed again, but only remade themselves over and over. So again, we must regard human and non-human histories as being intertwined, and history as not being configured by unified, progressive, linear time. The recent exhibition, The Word for World, the maps of Ursula K. Le Guin at the Architectural Association in London, is another example of planetary sense-making through maps, I think. The exhibition and the accompanying book encourages encourage us to reflect on how Le Guin's imaginary worlds might help us re-envision the present one. Her maps move beyond conventional cartography and open up inherited paradigms of knowledge, exploring the relationship between worlds and the way in which they are represented and imagined. They also imply that conventional cartography and the modern knowledge paradigm it forms part of constitutes what we might call a global reality setting that inhibits senses and feelings of planetarity. And I borrowed the notion reality setting from philosopher Federico Campagna, who understands reality setting as the definition of what exists, of what is possible in a given historical era. So you could say that the modern global reality setting, which is still largely in operation, does not allow for a sense of planetarity. It sets reality in a different way. On this background, I propose to investigate how artistic and aesthetic practices contribute to revitalizing our sensuous perception and everyday relations with the living and with other life forms, and thereby to the formation of a different worldview or a different form of world making by giving sensuous form to phenomena that are not immediately accessible to human attention. That is, that are not accessible through our habituated modes of perception and our increasingly impoverished languages. An example from my own local everyday environment of how aesthetic practice can sharpen our sensibility towards the natural and ecological conditions is the exhibitions, landscapes we share at the Aarhus School of Architecture. The project was realized by a group of landscape architects who, in collaboration with volunteer citizens, collected various plant seeds from areas around Aarhus and placed the seeds in a vessel made from digested plant material, that is cow dung, and from those same areas. And the areas are sort of open or semi-open landscapes that are dependent on animal and or human intervention to maintain themselves and the balance between different plant species and not turning into forests. Following the exhibition, the seeds were collectively dispersed across former agricultural land at the Moesgaard estate, characterized by low biodiversity and bordering on the areas where the seeds were collected. And the vessel and its base, made of locally sourced clay and also cow dung, were crushed and allowed to re-enter into a regenerative material cycle, you could say. In this way, the project invites participants and visitors to the exhibition to increase their knowledge of different plant species and their conditions of growth, thereby sharpening their sensibility for the grown and the living, enabling the grown and the living to enter into processes of sense-making. In the exhibition, the plant material is made present to our attention in its various states, not as representation in another medium, but as a mediation of itself. With the assistance of the group, it subsequently leaves the exhibition space and continues its life in the landscape surrounding Moesgaard, this estate where they picked it up. In traditional landscape and nature painting, nature is represented, rendered for a human observer, and the temporality of the human subject is separated from natural processes. And sort of this is the usual go-to image of the Kantian sublime. By contrast, the plant material in landscapes we share, although mediated and formally shaped, is not a representation and therefore does not allow the viewer the same distance or the same subject-object relation. The plants constitute the work's concrete aesthetic material. They are not depicted as motives in another medium or positioned in a temporality other than the motive's own. The physical manifestation of the work consists simply of plant material with which visitors are contemporaneous. and the prior collection of seeds and their subsequent dissolution and reintegration into the environment from which the work's components originate are as much a part of the work as the vessel itself. In line with the aesthetic thinking I seek to outline here, environmental media scholar Jennifer Gabrice points to collective sensing practices that consider sensing not from the perspective of a preformed universal human subject with fixed sensory apparatuses acting on a relatively inert world out there, but rather through the distinct distributions of sense and sensation that materialize across entities and environments, he says. Such sensing practices depart from the Kantian tradition of aesthetics centered on exclusively individual human contemplation and judgment. They are a way of connecting globality understood as human, worldly, cultural, political, and historical issues with planetarity understood as entanglements with more than human matters, scales, and temporalities. It is a practice of sensing and sense-making that reconnects aesthetics to the sentience of the environment, the sentience of things and natural material, and encourages us to conceive of aesthetics as a relational practice between people and things, dissociating it from the Kantian idea of judgment and the exclusively human cognitive power to sense and represent objects and their environment. With regard to the question of imagining and sensing planetarity, director of the research agency Forensic Architecture, El Weisman, develops together with cultural theorist Matthew Fuller a fruitful notion of the hyper-aesthetic image as part of an argument for the function of aesthetics beyond perception, or an aesthetics that decenters the human subject, basing it solely on human perception. In their theory of hyper-aesthetics turns all material occurrences to surfaces or points of manifestation that, each with their own particular parallax, may resolve as images. The way that an event occurs in the widest sense of its coming together will entail what is there to witness it, they write. The theory of hyper-aesthetics takes part in the development of an approach in which the Earth's material surface can be understood as an image, not because satellites now constantly stream images of it, as in this example, reminiscent of the blue marble, but because all elements of the Earth's surface continuously register their mutual, highly heterogeneous impacts and interactions. To apprehend these material interactions as images in the process of becoming entails a more attentive mode of sensing the world and a different way of being within it. I quote Fuller and Weisman again. They say, to see such material interactions as images is to become hyper-aestheticized to the world. But here, to hyper-aestheticize is to inhabit. Inhabiting an image means accepting the image being of all material surfaces and one's own actions and constitution within them. Indeed, to do so is to recognize the relatively contingent position of those figures, such as the artist or photographer, who might work with images. Every falling raindrop is a lens. We only need the right eyes and imagination to gaze through them. So it is such non-representational approach to forms in which the complex of climate crisis and planetarity is articulated that I'm after. And this may be seen in the poetics, I think, the poetics guiding the aesthetic practices, like that of researcher and artist Susan Schubley, exploring changed and expressive forms of environments and environmental processes as mediums in themselves, be they oceanic waves, atmospheric circulation, or the composition of ice core samples. The agency of the artist, the human being, makes common cause with the aesthetic agencies of the earth itself. The task is to explore not how nature is or can be represented by and to the human subject, but the ability of nature and natural material to represent itself and the events that have happened to it as its own material witness. For instance, how ice stores and preserves information about the Earth's ancient climates in its material substrates, but also how natural material can be regarded as its own material witness of anthropogenic pollution and carbon emissions. So this is a kind of photographic view on the Earth, its environments and its ecosystems. The world as a photographic image to be processed or developed. The photographic is a sort of inscription. Events are inscribed in the material surfaces in the environment in which they take place in an endless process of inscription and effacement. There's no privileged surface. All surfaces constantly register inscriptions and effacements, from the skin of our bodies to the rainforest. In that sense, we, together with the rest of the world, constitute a dynamic photographic image, and we must realize that we find ourselves in that dynamic image, not at a distance from it. Thanks, I'll end here.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Jacopo, for this. As I was listening to you, I mean, I like the way you talk because it's really clean and it's really, I mean, amazing how you're able to connect so many different important thoughts and try to, let's say, reinvent them also according to the way you interpret planetarity in this case, but also issues of time and anachronism. And there was a point in the beginning in which I also found connections with this book that you published a few years ago, Anachrony, Contemporaneity and Historical Imagination, which is part of the series of the contemporary condition you direct. And particularly, I am interested in the way you talked about the fact that the very issue of planetarity is kind of unthinkable outside of the Western paradigm and the Western perspective. And there is a moment during which, in the book, not in your talk, you mentioned Friedrich Jameson, and how Jameson, in framing postmodernism, was already touching upon the idea that we live in a perpetual present, that reinvents itself, that goes by abundance and acceleration, and somehow without, being able to move forward. Normally, when I talk about postmodernism and Jameson in class to students, I always show a music video by the Talking Heads, Road to Nowhere, in which you have David Byrne running towards nowhere, which was actually his own way to address, what people felt postmodernism was becoming in the 1980s specifically. So I don't know if this is something you want to elaborate on, the possibility of discussing planetarity also from a different perspective, but also considering it as a concept. Because, for example, next week we will have the summer school in Bologna on indigenous perspectives. For example, from the indigenous perspective, would be possible to talk about planetarity in the same way we conceive planetarity, with many references you made that make sense for us, but maybe don't make sense for someone from outside the global north kind of frame. This is something you address very, 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 very clearly to me, but if there is a way you can elaborate, that's a good way to start, maybe.
Yeah. Yes, I think to begin with Jameson, because sort of, yeah, Jameson famously said this sort of, and also repeated by Mark Fisher, but that it's easier for us to imagine the sort of how to say, the end of the world than the end of capitalism that has sort of brought us to where we are in the mess we are in, according to Jameson. And then he says that he has this definition of the postmodern is a weakness in our imagination, a weakness in terms of not being able to imagine the world otherwise. But I think, and I think he's right in many ways, but I also think that when he talks about postmodernity, it's very much, how to say, defined by what the prefix post is attached to. So it's still very much about, as in Lyotard, it's still very much about modernity and the modern, and it's still very much sort of embedded in a sort of Western way of thinking, but also it's somehow it seems as if it's mourning the end of modernity, sort of, and he also published a book, as you know, called A Singular Modernity, also wishing for something that sort of can bring things together again. This sort of unified, I would say, sort of historical view, and I think that's also something that someone like Peter Osborne suffers a bit from. He says that sort of because he talks about sort of when I talk about the modern regime of historicity, it's all about sort of, it's the way in which the past, the present, and the future is articulated, and now sort of the present has somehow disappeared in presentism, and he's sort of asking for when will the present begin again, because he wants the present to begin again on this, I would say, this linear kind of logic where you have a present from which you can project a qualitatively different future. But it's difficult to think futurity beyond this sort of one-dimensional progressive linear time logic. That's also my own problem, but I think that is the main, how to say, challenge we have. And I think I'm also very Eurocentric in many ways, also in my references, but I do try to take into consideration other points of view, and I also think, but I'm also a bit sort of skeptic obstacle towards to sort of embrace indigenous knowledge too easily, or as something that's some kind of monolithic worldview. But I do think that there's a lot to learn from the way in which you sort of think what we would call culture and nature in some kind of continuum, rather than something that's sort of disconnected from each other, sort of one of the main sort of insights. Maybe that's my to begin with. Am I answering?
Absolutely,
Okay,
absolutely. Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Yes, I can. So thank you so much, especially because the second part of your talk was a lot about mapping and remapping. So it was also, let's say, very close to my research, and so also very important for me. But I would, before, let's say, going on to this part of your talk, I would still stay on the idea of planetarity and ask you if, let's say, the juxtaposition between globality and planetarity as a kind of counter, let's say, concept in a way to globality could also be associated theoretically, of course, to the debate and let's say the difference between Anthropocene and all the different, let's say, other concepts like, of course, Capitalocene, Thulucene, Westocene, Hydrocene, and we have here the author of a beautiful book about Hydrocene, the Hydrocene. So another way, of course, to think from your perspective with time and with more than human time, let's say, to think and, let's say, also represent and more than represent, also tell about, let's say, yes, more than human, relational and decentralized, let's say, also concept that somehow decentralizes the human gaze and view from our thinking. No? So can it be, let's say, a good way of putting together, or in a way also confronting these different ways of thinking somehow, or of finding counter concepts that help us to understand and also to somehow also narrate and speak about our contemporaneity somehow. This then, of course, comes close to the representation, what artists are doing in trying to represent also via, let's say, images.
Yeah, it's. I'm afraid I don't think I have a. Thank you. I don't think I have a good answer to that, because I guess it's also. Because where I come from is sort of this sort of kind of philosophy and theories of time. So I have sort of. I'm still sort of very much sort of occupied by changes in our experience of time. Yeah. And now I say our human, but this is still very much about sort of human beings. But so for me, because I've heard myself talk about contemporaneity as this sort of temporality of globality for a long time, and when I'm sort of try to sort of communicate what I mean by it, one example is planetary scale computation as the architecture that allows contemporaneity, that allows this sort of pseudo co-presence on a global scale. And the other one is the Anthropocene, or the idea of the Anthropocene, that somehow forces this sort of planetary or global, how to say, sharing of time upon us as a species. But for a long time I haven't sort of taken it very seriously what sort of it actually implied. It was more like the interest was about establishing this contemporaneity, this shared global present. And getting older, I realize more and more, it feels more and more urgent to take this more seriously, what is implied by the notion of the Anthropocene. But I think that maybe I'm stuck a bit with the terms that are perhaps more temporally stem from temporal discussions, right, or discussions of temporality. I'm not.
No, it's fine.
Okay,
it's fine.
okay.
Yeah. Just from.
But it's
Yeah, another thing that characterizes your research, in my opinion, is also the way you are able to address from time to time science fiction. For example, the references you made to Ursula Le Guin and particularly that very, very interesting interpretation, like visual interpretation of the maps based on her science fiction stories. Can you say more about it? I mean, is it science fiction interesting for the stories it tells, or is it more for the structure?
Yeah. Well, I have to say that I'm for the Ursula Le Guin. It's actually. I'm no specialist on sci-fi, but I was just taken in by sort of dropping by this exhibition at the AA, and realized that whenever she started writing a new novel or story, she always began with a map. So she made a world before she actually described it in words. So I was just interested in that way of sort of world making, or this sort of more experimental.
Yeah, because the idea of mapping is so, I mean, is so like an exercise in imagination, and also like an instrument to achieve possibly planetarity or some forms of planetarity. I'm thinking of the maps you showed in the beginning, but also, I mean, consider, for example, Thomas More, Utopia. I mean, the map of Utopia as this kind of imaginary land, and so many maps related to utopian lands, imaginary places, submerged continents, Atlantis or whatever. So that type of imagination is it? I mean, can it be considered as a trigger to achieve those goals, or maybe it stays? Because I'm afraid, when talking with people who are really concrete and who are really pushing their feet on the ground, that they are not really seeing how much that form of visual eco-imagination can produce in society for real, because they think it's all, based on thoughts and on immaterial imagination, let's say.
Yeah, but as I said, this is the very beginning of the project. But I do that. That's my hypothesis, or the idea is that this way of sort of trying to do different ways of experimenting with mapping is one way of sort of generating this sort of awareness of planetarity, especially those that sort of somehow departs from the what I would call sort of modern cartography, sort of this sort of the domination or the wanting to see the world as something that can be totally ordered by this sort of modern scientific rational mode. So it's definitely
what you mean is the idea, the modern idea of the map as a tool to control people.
People and nature and the world
of
and
course.
Earth.
In this case, I always think of, how European countries, for example, took the map of Africa in order to split whatever property, they wanted to own through the colonies, which is like the perfect example of how the representation of Earth through a map can be used as a tool to practice that type of control.
Yeah. And the ordering of the world from Greenwich, sort of also temporally with the time zones, etc., to sort of make this map and then dominate the globe. You could say that the process of globalization, in a sense, was a process of mapping the whole of the world. Or the globe.
I really like the example of terraforma, which, of course, if you think about the Italian word terraferma, which means land, so you could, of course, interpret it from many different perspectives. So not just land, but also water, for instance. But terraferma means also land which is steady, no? Something which is steady. And so it's just the opposite of what the artists here were trying to do, no? To give this, or to try to represent this, not just vastness, but also complexity of different life forms, and also on materials, also on Earth. So probably I was now listening to Francesco's question about science fiction. Probably science fiction, let's say, gives more or leaves more space and let's say to imagination, of course, than science itself. Because another, let's say, if not problem I see, of course, in representing maps is, and which gives us also the idea of the complexity of the relationship between art and science and technology, is that, of course, to, let's say, represent the planet, or re-represent the planet in a more than human way, of course, from a human perspective or a non-anthropocentric perspective, it's a very difficult endeavor, because you can't decenter humanity, no, from this, let's say, representation. So probably science fiction, yes, gives more room, more space. So you were showing us examples that were starting from forms of mapping as drawing, and then as photographing, no, as well. So drawing and photography as two different ways in which to represent. But of course, they are both very human-centered somehow. So, and especially photography is, let's say, connected to science, connected to technology, no? And so it's different. It's difficult to, let's say, try to subvert. Very difficult to try to subvert more traditional forms of mapping and representation. So probably science fiction is a way to let's say, to give a try to be less scientific and less also linked to different technologies which evolved during let's say the human evolution. No? It's not really let's say a kind of question, but it's interesting how also finding specific case studies or also example of artists trying to, let's say, find new models of representations is already, of course, a form of mapping itself.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks
So,
for that.
are there any questions from the audience? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, there is the mic.
Oh, sure.
You want to say that? So
Sure.
we can
Sorry
hear
about
you.
that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me here. So my question was about the sublime, and if you could speak a little bit more about how that might be emerging in this contemporary moment that you're talking about, and where you're seeing it, and perhaps if it relates to the mapping as well, maybe to the digital. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. I think I'm a bit sort of, I have reservations about the use of the term sublime today, because at least in the sort of the Kantian understanding, the sublime is this, where was it? No, sorry. I forget the order. Oh yeah. This person standing over the sea of fog. It's about sort of being overwhelmed by nature, and not being able to grasp what is presented to you. So it can make you feel small as a human being, but then in Kant, you are saved because you have reason, because you have this moral superiority that Latour talked about in the quote I gave. So there's this idea that you are somehow saved, and also in sort of in temporal. My interest in the sublime is also that the sublime is sort of in the history of art. Barnett Newman, the sublime is now. It's this sort of idea that you grasp something in an instant, rather than this succession where our usual way of sort of perceiving the world, anything in the world, is sort of by ordering all the percepts that we receive in this sort of internal succession. But when we experience the sublime, or according to Kant, it was sort of in an instant. So it sort of corrupts or dismantles this sort of succession. So that was my initial interest or that's why I bought this a bit technical Kantian stuff, because it sort of somehow related to the idea of contemporaneity, this sort of global present that somehow also is very difficult. It's very difficult to produce something, an object that corresponds to the idea of contemporaneity. So it's more of an idea, exactly, but it's difficult to sort of give examples of contemporaneity in that sense. The same with the sublime. But I think also one of the very important things about the experience of the sublime is that you are somehow saved, that you are at a distance. Also, the wanderer here is also at a distance. We are even as viewers of the painting, we are even looking at someone having perhaps a sublime experience. And I think that's why I'm not sure about it's such a useful concept today, because when you talk about digital culture, when we talk about AI and all of that, there's no distance. And that's also why I sort of used the Latour quote to say that planetarity has erupted in our world, which doesn't allow us that kind of experience. We cannot see, let's say, nature, quote unquote, at a distance any longer. It's sort of our own involvement has become or is becoming increasingly obvious, and that's So I don't know whether I'm actually answering your question, but that's why I think that the use of the sublime it's difficult to maintain today, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Although a lot of, let's say, we speak of technological sublime, of course, a lot, and much of, I'm going back to photography again, much of the photographies that try to visualize or survey the Anthropocene are still very linked to the traditional idea of the sublime, especially aerial photography. So at least you have this sensation, and I think a lot of photographers want to, let's say, stay close to that tradition of the sublime. Somehow.
Yeah.
I'm also wondering in this picture, you know, because if it's 1818, guys literally had to walk up a mountain to get to that spot, and through a kind of density of biodiversity, which we simply don't have anymore. And so it's like, I'm wondering if, especially in your relation to your question about, you know, are there alternative kind of viewpoints that are, you know, I find that what matters is mostly about how much biodiversity people are actually interacting with day to day, as to how that kind of sense of distance and embeddedness, you know. I've lived in Denmark as well, and it's like, kind of, you know, there's a lot of flat, not, you know, it's a beautiful country, but there's a lot of, like, you know, farmland, and I guess, like, maybe in order to breach the distance, it's like more of a kind of, you know, you really have to get into the soil or the ocean. And I'm just wondering, like, it's hard to kind of understand what people were talking about when they were living with these, you know, in this case, like how many bites did he get trying to climb up that mountain? Or, I don't know, I'm also Australian, so I can hear your accent. You know, we're always kind of being like, animals are making their presence known to us, even if you are in urban areas in ways which I haven't experienced in other parts of Europe, I guess. Some parts, yes, but...
Yeah.
A question there, it's
no,
just a comment.
Good point, thanks. Thank you.
Well, just a reminder that this guy is one of those guys who possibly split the African map, right? Because it's about the same time when colonies became, you know, a structure of the world we still live in. Sorry, before the next question, I wanted to add something about this idea of trying to grasp, because I find really fascinating the idea of the sublime, which I never really went too much in depth into, but it's really resonating with what you said, the idea of not being able to grasp the wholeness of nature. And I was thinking also at an image, a picture you show, which is the picture taken of planet Earth during the Artemis mission a few weeks ago, which of course gets into dialogue with the blue marble. It's like this blue marble 2.0. And I wonder if that you know, lack of ability to grasp the wholeness is still valid in that case. Because when the blue marble started to circulate, you know, normally, at least this is what many visual culture scholars say, including Nick Mirzoff and many other people, we started to understand the fragility of the planet thanks to that photograph, because that was the first time we understood it as a whole, as a blue marble, as a little thing. So I don't know if you feel that way, and what has changed between the blue marble and the last photograph taken a few weeks ago.
Yeah, well, I think, yes, of course, there's also this sort of the becoming aware of the fragility that we are living on this globe. So, of course, it has done a lot, the Apollo photo, but it's also, in some readings, also in my reading today, it's also about sort of, it actually somehow testifies to this idea of the sublime, that it sort of escapes us, but now we are actually back in control somehow. It's sort of, we can even represent our own sort of condition for existing in that way. But I think that I think that's the other one, the other globe is even worse, so to speak, because you can visit websites where you have these satellite images of planet Earth sort of constantly updated, so you can sort of follow, and you have all these kinds of sensors. But what does that do? What does that do in terms of creating this sort of awareness of planetarity, or this sense of planetarity? And I'm not sure, at least it's far from enough, I would say. It's still, to me, in many ways, it's still sort of an expression of this sort of modern reality setting, to speak with Campagna. It's still sort of this sort of very sort of scientific way. I'm not saying that we should do away with science, but I'm just saying that it's not enough to have this sort of these exact images, etc. There's a lack of aesthetics in that, I think, or the sensing.
Interesting.
Yeah, well, sorry.
Thank you so much for a wonderful lecture, and it was also a joy to recollect and remember all these readings from Latour or Chakrabarty. I have a comment, and I also have a question. The first is a comment to address the satellite images and how they actually kind of create this disattachment to the landscape and to ecological condition. I work as a program director for Aral Culture Summit, which is an initiative around the Aral Sea. It's a lake between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan that now dried to 90%, creating the biggest human-made desert in the whole world, of the size of Switzerland or Ireland. And in our communications, we deliberately chose not to use satellite images of how the lake was drying, because of this very top-down, isolated approach, where the communities and the culture and the biodiversity, bicultural diversity, became like this very absent majority that was never really addressed. And we actually we used a lot of science fiction and myth-making approach, and this year's Uzbekistan National Pavilion in Arsenale actually approaches the Aral Sea through this sci-fi making, and very material, very handy. We also worked a lot with craftsmen from the region for that pavilion, but also some of the installations address it through more scientific, bio art approach, because we wanted to address this multiplicity of narratives that can navigate towards more sustainable future for the region. Yeah, so this is just a commentary because I can really relate to this this question. And the second question is about the question of planetary and sensing the planetary. I wonder what do you think about Benjamin Bratton's work around planetary scale computation and also like his ideas about how the planet itself becomes a sensing organism, and how the whole technosphere and technological development, and also like famously how the whole planet Earth was turned into a camera to sense the black hole and to create the image of a black hole.
Thank you. I have to admit, I was very much inspired by when he wrote The Stack and just the very notion of planetary scale computation. But I have to admit, I haven't followed his work recently, so I'm not too familiar with what you are referring. So I'm not so sure about what to what to say. I think when I'm interested in or the kind of photography that I was trying to talk about on top of Fuller and Weismann is more sort of seeing our natural surroundings, or the world, the Earth, as a photograph that we are part of. That sort of its way of being a photograph is that it constantly registers, like sort of how, I don't know how you say about the what happens in the old photograph with the salts, etc. But there's some kind of impression on a surface that sort of registers some kind of impact, and it's I think that's more in order to create how to say, sense of planetarity. I think that's at least for me, that's more interesting. Maybe that's a personal judgment, but I'm not so sure about the use of how to say, the computational stuff in Breton in order to get to where I'm trying to go with this. I have to say, but I'm a bit of an ignorant about the late Breton, so yeah. Sorry.
I think like with like planet trying to realize that it's a planet and trying as like this like blind microorganism trying to understand the vastness of the universe around it. I think it's kind of also connects to the notion of sublime. You know, like we trying to comprehend that we are part of something bigger as a planet, and the same way like planet as a cosmic body is trying to understand its place in the universe and in relation to other cosmic bodies, if we can call black hole a cosmic body.
Yeah. Thanks.
So, are there other questions or comments? Yes? Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this talk, of course, and the concept. And I have also a very brief comment and a very short question. The comment would be, I think it would deserve to develop this idea of the planetary, to put it into a pattern of the extraplanetary, because this is something I think is a current strategy to get rid of only the planet, and so this is the smaller scale now, and to put it, as you just mentioned, into the bigger realm of what's left outside the planetary, and then also, and this would lead also to my question, to go smaller scales, like the local scales, because I think, and this would be my question, if we say we, as you said a couple of times, when we discuss, when we behold, when we do this and that, I think we need to keep in mind, as you mentioned yourself, that we are talking here from a very privileged perspective, the Western realm, right? And I got reminded of a paper that the American colleague Kyle Perry wrote on ubiquity and photography. So this is my topic, photography, and this ongoing phrase, photography now is everywhere. And it's an ubiquitous thing to do and to use. And he just went back to data and showed, no, it's not. And it's just here and there on the planet. And if you look closely at where is the dispersal of photographic usages of digital cameras and so on, he could show in his paper huge areas in the world that are more or less blank. And so and this is of course surprising somehow when it comes to this shallow phrase of photography is everywhere. And I think when it comes to the planetary, I would be very interested to understand much better the positionality of speaking like that in a very hierarchical world that we are living in, right? And it's a Western concept. This is what I assume at least. And of course we could overcome this sort of concept and to come to something more, let's say, balanced in a, well, planetary scale.
Yeah, thanks. I think I have to come back on this, the extraplanetary, but I would also say that, not to sort of auto-immunize myself, but I would say that for me one of the most important sort of references is, and you could say Deepesh Chakrabarty, is he American or Indian? But sort of he wrote this sort of seminal text called Planetarity as an emergent category within the humanities, something to that effect. I think that was my sort of point of departure. So it's not, but I am very much aware that it is I am speaking from a very, very privileged environment. But that's also, I cannot escape myself, but I can of course try to transcend that privileged position. Another important reference for me is someone like Azile Mbembe, who's you could say that he's also part of a privileged sort of transnational intellectual class, blah blah. But still, I think it's still about sort of I think some of the main references talking about planetarity are actually not sort of solely you could say, are not solely exponents of this sort of Eurocentric place. But I will have to think more about the extra planetary and what to do about that. Yeah, thanks.
Do you have something to add about the extraplanetary? No, Stefan. Okay. Okay. So if there are no more questions, I'll thank you so much. Thank you to Jakob. Thank you to Francesco.
Thank you, Cristina.
And if you happen to be in Bologna next week, who knows, please join us. So the summer school will be from Monday to Friday, right?
Yeah.
So at the University of Bologna, and you can have a look on the website, the summer school and climate change.
Yes,
Yeah.
and Jacobo will be the keynote speaker, so you have another reason to come. So thank you.